One of the Vatican's most senior officials has been found guilty of child sex abuse in Australia.
This is a major story that has been kept under wraps for some time, but we can now report it. Cardinal George Pell was the third most important person in the Roman Catholic Church at the Vatican and was very close to the Pope himself. His conviction brings the global sexual abuse scandal to the very heart of the Vatican.
Pell and his defense team have maintained his innocence, saying the trial was only a means to destroy his reputation. A unanimous jury handed down the guilty verdict just before Christmas last year, but a court order has until now prevented the reporting of his conviction to protect the integrity of his second trial. And that trial has now been called off, so CNN can now report his conviction.
Anna Corrin has been following the case, joins us from outside the court in Melbourne. Now that second trial isn't happening. The gag order to so-called protect the jury in that second trial is no longer necessary. Fill us in on this extraordinary case and the importance of it.
Yeah, Michael, this is absolutely explosive, and it will send shockwaves not just here in Australia, but certainly around the world, right to the top of the Vatican. As you say, he is number 3 in the Vatican, treasurer of the Vatican. He is now the most senior member of the Catholic Church to be charged, to be convicted of child sexual assault. We have been sitting on this story for the last 2 months. As you say, there has been a suppression order in place due to that second trial. Well, that second trial, a short time ago, it collapsed. There wasn't enough evidence to proceed. There has been debate going on in the courtroom behind me here at Melbourne County Court, and the judge just a short time ago decided to lift that suppression order. No longer will the media sit on this story. It is now official. George Pell is a convicted pedophile. Now, what are these allegations, these convictions, what is it all about? It relates to 2 choir boys back in the late 90s when George Pell was Archbishop of Melbourne. He was Archbishop from 1996 to 2001. Now, the allegations by the Crown is that George Pell, he forced one of these choir boys to perform oral sex on him and perform indecent acts with the other 2. There was a charge a month later that he groped one of the choir boys in the hallway. Now, in relation to the second choir boy, he died several years ago from a drug overdose, which, as we know, is often the case with the survivors of sexual abuse. We've spoken to many survivors of clerical sexual abuse over the last week, and they talk of having problems with alcohol and with drugs and their life going completely off the rails. So there was only one choir boy who gave testimony before a jury of 12 Australians, and they deliberated for 2.5 days, and they found him guilty unanimously on all 5 charges. One of sexual penetration, the others of indecent assault. But as we say, this is extraordinary. We are waiting for George Pell to leave the courthouse. He is still out on bail. He will return here to this court to a plea hearing tomorrow. That is where his sentencing will be discussed, but that sentencing won't be handed down until next week. But as we say, Michael and Amara, this is absolutely explosive.
It is explosive. It is extremely extraordinary. Just when you consider his position, Cardinal Pell, I mean, he was the highest-ranking Catholic official in Australia, the 3rd highest in the Catholic Church. He was also one of the Pope Francis's most trusted advisors, and now you're talking about sentencing on Wednesday. So this is a man, a former high-ranking Catholic official who will likely face jail time. Is that correct, Anna?
Yeah, absolutely, Amara. He will definitely do jail time. That is what we are hearing, and perhaps a jail term from 5 to 10 years. It just depends. There was sentencing reform here in the state of Victoria in 2012. These crimes took place in the late 90s, so it will be up to the judge as to how he hands down his sentence and how severe it will be. But these are extremely serious charges, and obviously George Pell is going to have to do jail time. Speaking to other survivors of clerical abuse here in Victoria, they definitely want to see him do time, and they feel that if George Pell can be brought down for child sexual abuse, then no one in the church is untouchable.
So, I mean, what happens now? And just describe the impact of this in Australia. It was a major story. He was in Rome when he was advised of the charges. There was talk about his health at the time and whether he could return or not. He eventually did. This is a case that has consumed certainly the Australian media, but is now going to have a much broader audience given his position.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we will wait for word from the Vatican, but you would have to assume in the current climate, Michael, that the Pope is going to comment on this. Now, we know that when the conviction was handed down back in December, obviously we couldn't report it, that shortly after that, he was taken off the Council of Advisors, the unofficial Council of Advisors to the Pope. He was very close to Pope Francis. He was the Vatican of the Treasurer. This is a man who was instrumental at the Holy See, very highly regarded. And we also have to remember that when those charges were laid by police back in 2017, the Vatican vehemently defended George Pell. So we know that there's been this summit that's taken place in Rome, just concluded on the weekend, where Pope Francis called for an all-out assault on child sexual abuse within the church. He described those who abuse children as the tools of Satan. Well, I wonder what message he will be handing down to George Pell, someone who was so close to him, someone who was so high up in the Vatican himself, is now a convicted pedophile, Michael.
I want to focus a little bit on the abuse and what happened back in 1996 and 97. Again, Cardinal Pell, George Pell, being found guilty of sexually abusing these two choir boys. You mentioned one of them passed away from an overdose, sadly. Did we hear during this 4.5-week trial, did we actually hear from one of the choir boys?
Yes, we did, Amara. Well, the media didn't. It was in a restricted court, closed circuit. He gave evidence via video link. This is a young man now in his 30s who does not want to be identified. And we should probably backtrack as to why he went to the police. Now, there was a royal commission here in Australia into the institutional responses of child sexual abuse, and that started in 2012. In 2014, one of the choir boys, he was the one who took his own life. We know then that prompted the other choir boy, the surviving choir boy, to come forward, to go to police, to the Sano task force that had been set up investigating child sexual abuse. And he said that he wanted to tell the truth, that this was a secret that he was harbouring for so long. He talked during his testimony about never telling anybody, never wanting to tell anybody that he was at school on a scholarship. His parents were going through a divorce. He didn't want to jeopardise anything. As far as he was concerned, he was never, ever going to tell anybody. But it was his friend's death that prompted him to take action. But here's a little bit more for background.
Just so important to hear his side.
Awful, just an awful situation, yeah, not wanting to talk about it because of a scholarship. Anna, do stay with us. I want to come back and ask you some more questions, but to give more background on this, Cardinal Pell's conviction brings the global sexual abuse scandal to the very heart of the Vatican.
It sure does, and Pell and his defense team had been maintaining his innocence, saying the trial was just a means to destroy his reputation. Here's Anna Corrin with more on the story.
Right there, we all good?
It's news that will send shockwaves throughout the Roman Catholic Church. Cardinal George Pell, Vatican Treasurer, found guilty of child sex abuse. The most senior Vatican official ever convicted of child sex offences. The verdict came down in December, but legal restrictions meant it couldn't be reported in Australia until now. Pell, the country's most powerful Catholic, was on trial for assaulting 2 choir boys in the late 90s when he was Archbishop of Melbourne. The prosecution's case hinged on the testimony of one of those boys. He told the court Pell assaulted them after Mass, forced him to perform oral sex on him and committed an indecent act with his friend. He also testified that a month later, Pell pushed him against a wall and groped him. He said, quote, "I didn't tell anyone at the time. I had no intention back then of telling anyone ever." The other victim died of a drug overdose as an adult, having never told his family of the abuse. The Cardinal called the allegations outrageous.
I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
He didn't take the stand during the trial. Instead, a video of his interview with Australian detectives was played to the court. He pleaded not guilty, and his defence lawyer said the accusations were a fantasy. But a jury convicted Pell on all 5 charges. 1 of the sexual penetration of a child, and 4 of an indecent act with or in the presence of a child. It's a shocking fall from grace for one of the Vatican's top officials, who has long been an influential, if divisive, figure in Australia. He rose through the ranks of the Church to become Archbishop of Melbourne, then Sydney, then a cardinal, before being appointed Vatican Treasurer and a member of the Pope's informal Council of Advisors. But while his star rose in the Vatican, Pell came in for mounting criticism at home, as the Australian Church became the centre of a global child abuse scandal. A national inquiry into institutional responses to child sexual abuse found 7% of the country's Catholic priests were accused of abusing children between 1950 and 2010. It identified nearly 2,000 alleged perpetrators, including priests, brothers, lay people and religious sisters.
That the Cardinal had given...
When he appeared in front of the Royal Commission in 2016, Pell faced questions about whether he had done enough to weed out abuse and get justice for the victims. Now the Cardinal himself has been convicted, and other survivors of clerical sexual abuse unrelated to the Pell case are elated.
Justice is what I thought, justice for the victims. I think that should give everyone that's thinking about, whether you'll be believed or whether you will or won't win the fight, it should give you the courage to come forward and at least be heard.
Pell's conviction will hurt an organisation already battling decades of revelations about paedophile priests. The Pope removed Pell from his advisory council in December. But the damage to the Church may be difficult to repair. Now this global crisis has reached the top of the Vatican. Anna Corrin, CNN, Melbourne.